a duke who lived by the rules, and the woman who tore the rulebook to shreds. The ballroom of the Duchess of Danbury was a place where silence was a currency and reputation was a religion. Under the golden glow of 1,000 beeswax candles, the London ton moved in a choreographed ballet of stifled yawns and rigid etiquette. At the center of this frozen world stood Gabriel St, the Duke of Ravenwood. In his navy blue velvet evening coat and a cravat tied with mathematical precision, he was the very image of aristocratic perfection. To the men, he was a pillar of the establishment. To the women, he was a beautiful, unreachable glacier. Gabriel lived his life in the shadows of should and must, his heart locked behind a ribcage of pure iron. But then, the heavy oak doors swung open, and the ice began to crack. Lady Beatrix Bibi Vane didn't enter a room, she conquered it. While the other debutantes wore pastels that faded into the wallpaper, Bibi was a flash of lightning in a bottle. Her gown was a scandalous, vibrant emerald green that clung to her curves with an audacity that made the older matrons reach for their smelling salts. Her hair, a voluminous, fiery red manet, flowed wildly over her shoulders, looking less like a hairstyle and more like a controlled forest fire. But it was the sleeves that truly set the room on edge. They were slashed and tattered, trailing behind her like the wings of a fallen, defiant angel. She didn't wait for a formal introduction. She didn't wait for Gabriel to notice her. She marched through the sea of silk and lace, her gaze fixed on the Duke with a defiant intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. The music seemed to stutter. The whispers died. Gabriel stood his ground, his jaw set, his brooding expression masking the sudden, violent thrumming of his pulse. He was prepared to dismiss her with a cold nod, to uphold the dignity of his title. But Bibi Vane had no interest in his title. She had an interest in the man beneath it. Before he could utter a single word of polite disdain, she was in his personal space. The scent of jasmine and rebellion filled his lungs. Without a hint of hesitation, Bibi reached up, her fingers gripping the lapels of his navy velvet coat. She pulled him toward her, forcing the great Duke of Ravenwood to look down into a face that radiated absolute, fearless heat. "You look bored, Your Grace," she whispered, her voice a low hum that vibrated through his very chest. "And a man as beautiful as you should never be this dull." Gabriel's hands instinctively moved to her waist, not to push her away, but to steady himself against the sudden earthquake she had brought into his life. He looked down at her, his serious features warring with a longing he hadn't felt in years. He represented the rules. She represented the riot. And as the entire ballroom held its collective breath, the Duke realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't want to be perfect. He wanted to be consumed. The air in the Duchess of Danbury's ballroom was thick with the suffocating scent of lilies and the even heavier weight of expectation. It was a place where a tilted fan could signal a clandestine meeting and a missed curtsy could end a bloodline's social standing. Gabriel St, the Duke of Ravenwood, stood near the refreshments, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand. He was the anchor of the evening, a man so impeccably dressed in his navy velvet evening coat and high-collared white cravat that he looked less like a human and more like a masterpiece of Regency architecture. His jaw was a sharp line of discipline, and his eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the room with the weary judgment of a man who had seen every trick the ton had to offer. To Gabriel, life was a series of boxes to be checked. Honor, legacy, propriety. He had spent years erasing the whispers of his father's erratic past, building a reputation of such granite-like stability that no one dared question the Ravenwood name. He was the perfect duke, and he was bored to the very marrow of his bones. Then, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall didn't just open, they seemed to recoil. The music didn't stop, but it faltered, the violins screeching into a confused silence as Lady Beatrix Bibi Vane made her entrance. She was a riot of color in a world of muted pastels. Her gown was a vibrant, unapologetic emerald green, the silk catching the candlelight and throwing it back like a challenge. But it wasn't just the color that caused the room to gasp, it was the construction. The sleeves were slit from shoulder to wrist, tattered ribbons of silk fluttering as she moved, revealing flashes of porcelain skin that no proper lady would ever dare show in public. Gabriel's judgmental eye narrowed. He had heard of the vivid Vane, the woman who treated the social register like a list of suggestions rather than laws. But seeing her was a different matter entirely. Her hair was a wild, voluminous crown of fiery red, refusing to be tamed by the intricate pins that held other women's spirits in place. She looked like a flame that had accidentally wandered into a library. He prepared his most freezing glare, the one that usually sent ambitious debutantes scurrying back to their mothers. As she marched toward him, not gliding, but marching with a predatory grace, he tightened his grip on his glass. She ignored the counts, the marquises, and the whispers that followed her like a wake behind a ship. Her focus was locked on him. When she reached him, the heat radiating from her was almost physical. Gabriel looked down at her, his expression a mask of stony disapproval. "Lady Beatrix," he said, his voice a low, warning rumble. "I believe the invitation called for formal attire, not a costume for a shipwreck." Bibi didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped into his personal space, defying every rule of distance and decorum. "And I believe a duke is meant to be a leader, Ravenwood," she countered, her voice like velvet dragged over gravel. "Not a statue guarding a buffet table." Before he could offer a stinging retort, her hands moved. In a move that drew a collective shriek from the nearby wallflowers, she gripped the lapels of his navy coat. Her knuckles brushed the crisp white of his cravat as she pulled him downward, forcing his aristocratic face inches from her own. Gabriel's heart, usually a steady, rhythmic clock, slammed against his ribs. Up close, her eyes weren't just defiant, they were searching. She looked at him not as a title or a fortune, but as a man who was suffocating under his own perfection. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Ravenwood found himself unable to look away, caught in the gravity of a woman who was far too bold, far too scandalous, and exactly what his frozen heart feared most. The collective intake of breath from the onlookers sounded like a sudden wind through dry leaves, but Gabriel barely heard it. All he could feel was the weight of Bibi's hands on his lapels and the sheer, magnetic heat radiating from her defiant gaze. Realizing that the eyes of every gossip in London were boring into their backs, Gabriel didn't pull away. Instead, he allowed his hands to settle firmly on her waist, a move that was half restraint and half surrender, and steered her toward the open French doors that led to the moonlit terrace. He moved with a predatory efficiency, cutting through the crowd until the suffocating scent of lilies was replaced by the crisp, cool air of the night and the heavy fragrance of blooming jasmine. Once they were shielded by the deep shadows of a stone balustrade, Gabriel finally released her, though his blood continued to hum with an uncharacteristic rhythm. He turned to face her, his silhouette tall and imposing against the silver moonlight. "You are playing a dangerous game, Lady Beatrix," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "That display in there, you realize you've practically handed the shears to clip your wings permanently?" Bibi didn't look like a woman who feared being grounded. She leaned back against the cold stone, her fiery red hair cascading over the emerald silk of her gown like a river of embers. She reached up to adjust one of her tattered sleeves, the movement slow and deliberate, drawing his eyes to the pale skin of her shoulder. "My wings were clipped the moment I was born into this funeral of a society, Your Grace," she replied, her voice laced with a bittersweet amusement. "I'm just the only one brave enough to tear the silk and see what's underneath." Gabriel stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her whole. He was the Duke of Ravenwood, a man who had spent a decade building a fortress of propriety to protect a legacy that had nearly been ruined by his father's excesses. To him, her chaos was an infection. "There is a difference between bravery and self-destruction," he countered, his jaw tight. "You thrive on the scandal. You want them to look at you with horror because it's easier than asking them to look at you with respect." Bibi's smile didn't reach her eyes this time. She took a single step forward, closing the gap until the hem of her vibrant dress brushed against his navy velvet coat. She looked up at him, her sharp features softened by the moonlight, searching the brooding depths of his expression for a crack in the marble. "And you thrive on the silence, Gabriel. You've spent so long playing the part of the perfect aristocrat that you've forgotten how to breathe without permission. She reached out, not to grab him this time, but to trace the line of his cravat with a single, daring finger. The touch was light, but it felt like a brand. "Look at you," she whispered, her voice a soft, mocking caress. "So cold. So still. You aren't a man, Ravenwood. You are nothing but a handsome statue, carved by your father's ghost and polished by the ton until there's nothing human left inside. I wonder, if I pushed you hard enough, would you shatter? Or would you finally wake up?" The insult bit deeper than any gossip's barb ever could. For a heartbeat, the Duke's discipline wavered. The handsome statue felt a surge of very human, very messy anger and something far more volatile. He caught her hand, his fingers locking around her wrist, not with the coldness of a duke, but with the territorial heat of a man pushed to his limit. The scent of scandal wasn't just in the air, it was between them, thick and intoxicating. "Be careful what you wish for, Bibi," he warned, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "Because if I wake up, I might just decide that you're the first thing I want to take." Gabriel let go of her wrist as if the heat of her skin had finally burned through his velvet gloves. He turned away from her, his gaze fixing on the dark, manicured hedges of the estate, which stood like silent sentinels in the moonlight. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant, muffled lilt of a waltz from the ballroom and the frantic, uncharacteristic beating of his own heart. He looked at his hands that had spent 15 years meticulously rebuilding what another man's passion had torn down. "You think this is a mask I wear for sport, Beatrix?" he asked, his voice so low it was almost swallowed by the night air. He didn't use her title. The omission felt like an intimacy he couldn't afford, a crack in his own carefully constructed armor. "You think I enjoy the suffocating weight of this cravat or the endless, hollow politeness of the ton?" He turned back to her, his eyes dark with a sudden, jagged vulnerability that made the handsome statue look startlingly human. "My father was a man of fire, much like you. He followed his heart into every gambling hell in London and every bed that wasn't his wife's. He didn't just live, he consumed. And when he was finished, he left behind a trail of ashes that nearly buried us all." Bibi stood perfectly still, her tattered emerald sleeves fluttering like wounded wings as she watched him. The mocking glint in her eyes had faded, replaced by a quiet, piercing curiosity that made Gabriel feel more exposed than if he were standing naked in the center of the ballroom. "I was 12 when I watched the bailiffs carry the furniture out of Ravenwood Hall," Gabriel continued, the words coming out like blood from an old wound he had tried to cauterize with duty. "I watched my mother wither away from the shame of his public brawls and his very bold decisions. He died in a gutter after a duel over a woman whose name he probably couldn't remember the next morning. He left me a title that was a joke, a mountain of debt, and a family name that smelled of rot." He stepped toward her, his shadow looming large against the terrace wall, almost swallowing her vibrant green form. "I didn't choose to be a statue, Beatrix. I carved myself into one because marble doesn't bleed, and it certainly doesn't gamble away the lives of everyone it loves. Every rule I follow, every boring tradition I uphold, is a brick in the wall that keeps the Ravenwood name from sliding back into the mud. To you, my propriety is a cage. To me, it is the only thing keeping the roof over my sisters' heads." The air between them shifted, the tension turning from antagonistic to something thick and suffocatingly private. The secret was out, the burden of a son atoning for the sins of a father. Bibi saw that his obsession with perfection wasn't born of arrogance, but of a marrow-deep fear of the very fire she carried within her. She was a living embodiment of the chaos that had destroyed his childhood, yet as she looked at him, she didn't see a duke to be challenged. She saw a man who had been holding up the sky for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to simply stand. "So," Bibi said softly, her voice no longer mocking, but dangerously tender. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from his navy velvet sleeve. "You've spent your whole life being the anchor so no one else has to drown. But tell me, Gabriel, who is holding the anchor? Or are you just planning to sink with it?" Gabriel looked at her, and for a terrifying second, The rules didn't matter. The family secret was laid bare under the moonlight, and the woman he should have feared most was the only one who seemed to see the man dying inside the masterpiece. The stone steps of the terrace gave way to the soft, damp moss of the Duchess's private botanical garden, a place designed for quiet contemplation that had long since been abandoned by the rowdy guests of the ball. Here, the silver light of the moon filtered through the weeping willow branches, creating a cage of shadows and light around them. Gabriel walked beside Bibi, his stride no longer the measured, stiff gait of a man on parade, but something heavier, more grounded. The revelation of his father's ruin felt as though he had physically unburdened himself of a leaden weight, yet the air where the secret had been felt cold and hollow. Bibi didn't lead him to a bench or a fountain. Instead, she stopped in a small clearing where the scent of night-blooming jasmine was so thick it was almost intoxicating. She turned to face him, the fiery red of her hair appearing like dark wine in the moonlight. She reached up and, for the first time, her movements weren't calculated to shock or provoke. She slowly began to unpin the tattered silk of her sleeve, letting the emerald fabric drape loosely against her arm. "You've been holding your breath for 15 years, Gabriel," she said softly, her voice missing its usual sharp, mocking edge. "I can hear it in the way you speak. Every word is a battle to stay upright." Gabriel leaned against the trunk of an ancient oak, his navy velvet coat catching on the rough bark. He didn't pull away. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the faint tremor in her own hands. The vivid Vane was gone, replaced by a woman who looked small against the vastness of the night. "And what of you, Beatrix? You tear your clothes and scream at the world to look at you. Is that your way of breathing? Or are you just trying to drown out the silence before it can tell you who you really are?" Bibi flinched, a small, genuine movement that told him his barb had found its mark. She stepped closer, not to challenge him, but to find warmth. "Maybe both," she admitted, her gaze dropping to the high collar of his cravat. "If I'm the monster they say I am, then I don't have to worry about being the daughter my mother wanted. I don't have to worry about being enough. Because a scandal is never expected to be anything but scandalous." She reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched the edge of his jaw. This wasn't the bold grip of the ballroom, it was a tentative, searching caress. "We're both hiding, Gabriel. You hide behind the rules, and I hide behind the wreckage of them. But right now, in this garden, the ton doesn't exist. There are no debts to pay, and no reputations to burn." Gabriel closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. The marble was finally breaking. The Duke of Ravenwood, the man of iron and ice, felt a tear escape the corner of his eye, not out of sadness, but out of the sheer, terrifying relief of being seen. He reached up, covering her hand with his own, his thumb tracing the delicate pulse in her wrist. "I don't know how to be anything else," he whispered, the admission a jagged confession. "I've forgotten who the man was before the title took him." "Then let's find him," Bibi whispered back. She moved into his space, her head resting against his chest, right over his pounding heart. "He's still in there. I can feel him fighting to get out." For a long moment, they simply stood in the stillness of the midnight garden, two broken halves of a society that demanded perfection. The mask hadn't just slipped, it had shattered on the mossy ground. And in the silence that followed, Gabriel realized that for the first time since he was 12 years old, he wasn't afraid of the fire. He was grateful for the warmth. The jasmine-scented air of the garden felt like a sanctuary, but as the distant music of the ballroom drifted over the hedges, the reality of Gabriel's life began to press back in. He straightened his back, the invisible weight of the Ravenwood legacy settling once more onto his shoulders. He reached for his cuffs, adjusting them with the practiced, mechanical precision of a man preparing to step back into a cage. "I should return," he murmured, though his eyes remained fixed on Bibi. "The Duchess expects me to lead the final set. If the Duke of Ravenwood vanishes into the night with the most talked-about woman in London, the morning papers will be merciless." Bibi watched him, her fiery red hair catching the moonlight as she tilted her head. She didn't move away. Instead, she stepped into the small space between them, her gaze dropping to the high, stiff collar of his white cravat. It was a masterpiece of silk, knotted with such perfection that it seemed to hold his very chin in place. It was the ultimate symbol of his restraint. "You're doing it again," she whispered. "You're tightening the noose before you've even felt what it's like to breathe." Before he could protest, her fingers were at his throat. They weren't clutching his lapels in defiance this time, they were nimble and certain. With a deft flick of her wrist, she caught the edge of the silk tie. Gabriel froze, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs that had nothing to do with propriety. "Beatrix, stop," he said, but the command lacked its usual iron. She ignored him. With a gentle tug, the intricate knot, the one he had spent an hour perfecting before the mirror, simply unraveled. The silk fell loose, the ends draping over his navy velvet coat like a surrendered flag. For the first time in his adult life, Gabriel felt the cool night air directly against the skin of his throat. It was a small thing, a minor infraction in the eyes of the world, but to a man who lived by the millimeter, it felt like a revolution. "There," she said, her voice a low, melodic challenge. "The statue has a crack. Shall we see if it can run?" "Run?" Gabriel asked, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. "The Duchess's stables are less than a mile through the woods," she said, her eyes dancing with a dangerous, infectious light. "She has a pair of chestnuts that haven't been exercised all day. No carriages, no footmen, no choreographed dances. Just the road and the wind. If we leave now, we can be 5 miles away before they even notice the Duke is missing from the floor." Gabriel looked at the loose silk hanging from his neck. He looked at the tattered emerald sleeves of her gown, which seemed to beckon him toward the dark, unmanicured edge of the estate. To leave a ball without a carriage was unthinkable. To ride in the moonlight with a woman of ruined reputation was social suicide. He thought of the ledger books, the debt, and the heavy, silent halls of Ravenwood. Then he looked at Bibi. She wasn't offering him a scandal, she was offering him a moment of existence that belonged to no one but himself. "The Ton will call this my final ruin," Gabriel said, a slow, predatory smile finally breaking through his brooding mask. "Let them," Bibi replied, reaching out her hand. "I've been ruined for years, Gabriel. It's quite liberating once you get used to the view." Gabriel didn't hesitate. He reached out and gripped her hand, not with the polite touch of a dance partner, but with the desperate strength of a man grabbing a lifeline. He shed his navy velvet coat, tossing it onto the mossy ground as if it were the heavy skin of a former life. In his waistcoat and his loosened silk tie, he followed the red-headed whirlwind into the shadows of the trees. For the first time in 15 years, the Duke of Ravenwood wasn't walking toward a duty. He was running toward a fire. The morning sun over Mayfair was usually a warm, golden invitation, but today it felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. By noon, the scent of jasmine from the Duchess of Danbury's garden had been replaced by the metallic tang of sharpened knives, not of the kitchen variety, but the verbal ones wielded over porcelain teacups and silver breakfast trays. The Ton did not move with the speed of a riot, but with the cold, crushing inevitability of a glacier. The discovery had been made at dawn, the Duke of Ravenwood's navy velvet evening coat, discarded like a shed skin on the mossy ground of the garden, and a single, tattered emerald silk ribbon caught in the briars near the stables. The Duke had vanished. The vivid Vane had vanished. And with them, the carefully maintained illusion of Ravenwood's untouchable perfection had evaporated into the morning mist. In the drawing rooms of the elite, the air was frigid. Lady Danbury, along with a phalanx of high-collared matriarchs, sat in a circle of judgment that felt more like a court-martial than a social call. They didn't speak of the Duke's impulsiveness with anger, they spoke of it with pity, as if he had been struck by a sudden, tragic fever. The blame was directed entirely at the source of the contagion, Beatrix Vane. "She didn't just tempt him," whispered the Countess of Morley, her eyes narrow and bright with the thrill of the hunt. "She dragged him into the mud. To leave a ball on horseback. In the dead of night. Without a chaperone or even a coat. It isn't just a scandal. It is an insurrection against every value we hold dear." The plot for Bibi's social exile was mapped out with surgical precision. It began with the long silence. By 1 o'clock, every invitation addressed to Vane House that had not yet been sent was unceremoniously tossed into the fire. The callers who arrived at her door found only a closed gate and a sudden, inexplicable absence of the families they once shared tea with. The ton was a beast that survived on recognition, and they had decided that, from this moment forward, Lady Beatrix Vane would be invisible. Bibi felt the first strike that afternoon when she attempted her daily ride through Hyde Park. Usually, her presence was a storm that people watched from a distance, shocked, yes, but captivated. Today, the world was a wall of ice. As her horse trotted past the carriages of the wealthy, women who had known her since she was a girl suddenly found intense interest in the stitching of their parasols. Men who had once clamored for her favor looked through her as if she were made of glass. The vivid Vane was being erased, one turned shoulder at a time. But the most dangerous part of the ton's strike wasn't the silence, it was the rescue. Even as they moved to destroy Bibi, they were already sending emissaries to Gabriel. They were framing her as the predator and him as the victim of a momentary lapse in judgment. They were building a golden cage of forgiveness for him, provided he returned to the marble pedestal they had built for him and never looked at the red-headed firebrand again. The stakes had never been higher. If Bibi stayed, she would be a ghost in a city that hated her. If Gabriel accepted their mercy, he would lose the only woman who had ever seen his soul. The ton had struck back with the most powerful weapon in their arsenal, the threat of total isolation. As Bibi stood alone on the edge of the Serpentine, the wind whipping her fiery hair across her face, she realized that being fearless was no longer about tearing sleeves or making scenes. It was about surviving the cold when the world finally turned out the lights. The silence of Ravenwood Hall had always been a source of pride for Gabriel, a testament to the order and control he had fought so hard to restore. But today, as he stepped into the morning room, the quiet felt like a tomb. Sunlight filtered through the towering windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the ramrod-straight figure of his mother, the Dowager Duchess, seated by the fireplace. She didn't look up from her embroidery, but the tension in her hands, the way she gripped the silver needle, told him she had already heard everything the gossips were whispering from Mayfair to Chelsea. "I am told the Duchess of Danbury found your evening coat in the dirt, Gabriel," she said, her voice like a thin blade of ice. "Along with the dignity of this family." Gabriel stood in the center of the room, his white cravat still missing, the collar of his shirt open at the throat where Bibi's fingers had unraveled his restraint. He felt the weight of the ancestral portraits lining the walls, hundreds of years of St. Clair's watching him, judging the man who had dared to run through the woods in his shirt sleeves. "The coat was a trifle, Mother. I was simply breathing." "You were drowning," she countered, finally looking up. Her eyes were dark with a fear he recognized, the same fear that had haunted them when the bailiffs were at the door 15 years ago. "That woman is a wildfire, Gabriel. She doesn't just want your heart, she wants to consume the very foundations of this house. Have you forgotten why we live the way we do? Have you forgotten the smell of the bailiff's ink and the way your sisters cried when they were told they might have to live in a cottage in the country?" Gabriel felt the familiar iron band of duty tightening around his chest. He thought of his younger sisters, their bright futures currently balanced on the razor's edge of his reputation. If he fell, they fell. "Beatrix is not my father," he said, though the words felt fragile. "She is the only person who sees me, Mother. Not the title, not the fortune. Me." The Dowager Duchess rose, her silk gown rustling like dead leaves. She walked to him, her face a mask of aristocratic sorrow. "A duke does not have the luxury of being seen. He only has the duty of being followed. The ton has already begun the excision. They will forgive a moment of madness if you return to us now. I have already sent word to Lord Stirling that you will be calling on his daughter, Cecily, this afternoon. She is quiet, she is respectable, and she will provide the anchor this family needs. And if I refuse?" Gabriel's voice was a low, jagged rasp. His mother reached out, her hand cold against his cheek. Then you are no longer the Duke of Ravenwood in anything but name. I will take your sisters to the estate in the north. We will live in the shadows of the scandal you have chosen. You will keep your fire, Gabriel, but you will find that it keeps no one warm in a house that has been stripped of its honor. You have two lives laid out before you, the one that saves us, or the one that destroys us. She pulled away, the ultimatum hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. The carriage for the Sterling's estate will be ready at 4 o'clock. If you are not in it, do not bother coming home tonight. Gabriel stood alone in the center of the vast, silent room. He looked at his hands, the hands that had gripped Bibi's waist in the moonlight, and felt the crushing gravity of the choice. He could be the savior his family needed, a man of marble and shadow, or he could be the man who let the world burn just to feel the heat of a single woman's love. The Ravenwood title was a crown of thorns, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he had the strength to keep wearing it. The silence at Vane House was far more deafening than the whispers of the ballroom ever were. Bibi stood in the center of her bedchamber, the emerald green gown discarded across a chair like a dying flame. She was dressed in a simple, dark traveling suit, her fiery hair pulled back with a severity that made her features look sharp, almost fragile. On the bed lay a single trunk, half filled with the few things she truly cared for. She had seen the way the carriages avoided her street that morning. She had felt the sudden, chilling absence of the world she had spent her life mocking. But it wasn't the social exile that hurt. It was the news that had reached her through a loyal maid, the news of the Dowager Duchess's ultimatum. Gabriel was a man of honor, and she was the fire that was burning his house down. She knew him well enough to know he would choose the ashes just to stay near her, and she loved him enough to realize she couldn't let him. The heavy front door downstairs slammed open with a violence that shook the floorboards. Bibi didn't need to hear the footsteps to know who it was. The measured Duke was gone. In his place was a man who moved with a frantic, jagged purpose. Gabriel burst into the room, his white shirt open at the collar, his hair disheveled by the wind. He saw the trunk, and the air seemed to leave his lungs in a single, ragged gasp. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded, his voice hovering between a roar and a plea. Bibi didn't look at him. She focused on folding a silk shawl, her fingers trembling. "I'm leaving, Gabriel. To the continent, perhaps. Or the countryside. Somewhere where the name Vane doesn't sound like a curse." "You're running," he said, stepping toward her, his shadow stretching across the room to meet her feet. "I'm saving you," she snapped, finally looking up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your mother is right. I am a wildfire, and you are a man built of wood and history. If I stay, Ravenwood falls. Your sisters lose their futures. You lose the only thing you've spent 15 years building. I won't be the reason the great Duke of Ravenwood ends up in a cottage in the north." She tried to push past him, but Gabriel was no longer a statue. He caught her by the arms, his grip firm but desperate. "Don't you understand? I've spent 15 years building a cage, not a life. I thought I was protecting them, but I was just dying in the dark." "You're talking like a madman," Bibi whispered, her hands coming up instinctively to rest against his chest. She could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a wild, untamed thing that matched her own. "They'll ruin you. They'll erase you. Let them," Gabriel growled. He pulled her flush against him, his hands sliding to her waist with a sense of ownership that brooked no argument. He looked down at her, his brooding expression replaced by a fierce, terrifying clarity. "I have played the Duke for everyone else. I have worn the cravat and kept the silence and stood as the anchor until I was ready to sink. But I will not lose the only person who actually made the heart inside this marble beat. Gabriel, please," she sobbed, her forehead dropping against his shoulder. "Be the man they need you to be." "I am being the man I need to be," he countered, lifting her chin so she had no choice but to see the fire in his eyes. "You told me I was a handsome statue. You told me to wake up. Well, I am awake, Beatrix. And I am not letting you go back into the shadows just so I can sit in a cold room with a title that feels like a shroud." He didn't just hold her, He anchored her. In that moment, the fearless Lady Vane felt the sheer strength of a man who had finally found something worth breaking the rules for. The trunk remained half-packed on the bed, a forgotten relic of a sacrifice he refused to accept. The world outside might be turning out the lights, but in the center of the room, the fire was only beginning to grow. The Royal Opera House was a horseshoe of gold, velvet, and sharpened judgment. Tonight, it served as the site of a public execution. Lady Beatrix Vane sat in her family's box, her back as straight as a soldier's, though the emerald silk of her gown felt more like a target than a garment. The boxes on either side of her were conspicuously empty, a dead zone of social contagion that whispered louder than the orchestra tuning below. Every pair of opera glasses in the house was trained on her, not the stage, waiting for the moment she would finally crumble under the weight of the silence. Then, the doors to the Vane box opened. The rustle of silk and the sharp intake of 100 breaths rippled through the theatre. Gabriel St didn't enter with the measured, cautious grace of the Duke of Ravenwood. He walked with the heavy, certain stride of a man who had already set fire to the bridge behind him. He wore no high-collared cravat, his shirt was open at the throat, revealing the pulse that beat for no one but the woman sitting in the shadows. He didn't look at the stage. He didn't look at the Dowager Duchess, who sat in the Ravenwood box across the abyss, her face a mask of frozen horror. He looked only at Bibi. "I believe this seat is taken," Gabriel said, his voice carrying through the quiet house with the authority of a thunderclap. Bibi looked up, her eyes wide, the fiery red of her hair clashing beautifully against the pale, stunned faces of the ton. "Gabriel, go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're watching. If you sit here, there is no going back. The title, the legacy, it all burns." Gabriel didn't hesitate. He sat beside her, his thigh brushing against her emerald skirts, his presence an immovable wall between her and the world's disdain. He reached out and took her hand, interlacing his fingers with hers in full view of the king's own box. "Then let it burn," he said, loud enough for the gossips in the front row to hear. "I spent 15 years as a statue in a graveyard. I'd rather be a man in the ashes with you." Lord Stirling, standing in the aisle with his daughter Cecily, cleared his throat, his face purple with indignation. "Ravenwood, think of what you are doing. You are throwing away centuries of honor for a scandal." Gabriel turned his head slowly, his brooding gaze now sharpened into something lethal and free. "Honor is not found in the cut of a cravat or the silence of a drawing room, Stirling. It is found in the courage to stand by what you love when the world tells you to be a coward. If being a duke means living a lie, then I am happy to be a commoner." A low murmur broke out, a chaotic swell of sound that drowned out the first notes of the overture. The Dowager Duchess rose and swept out of the theatre, her exit a final, silent disowning. But Gabriel didn't flinch. He leaned in closer to Bibi, his breath warm against her ear, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "You said I was a handsome statue," he murmured, a slow, triumphant smile breaking through his serious features. "Well, I've finally shattered, Beatrix. And I've never felt more alive." In that moment, as the lights dimmed for the performance, the scandal was complete. The perfect duke was gone, replaced by a man who had found his freedom in the wreckage of his reputation. Bibi leaned her head against his shoulder, her fearless heart finally finding a place to rest. They were ruined, they were scandalous, and they were, for the first time in their lives, absolutely, undeniably free. The dust of the great scandal did not settle so much as it was swept away by a gale of change. In the months that followed that fateful night at the Opera House, the iron gates of Ravenwood Hall were no longer guarded by the grim spectre of propriety. Instead, they were thrown wide to a new kind of society. The Ravenwood Revolution had begun, and it was a world painted in the vibrant, unapologetic colors of Lady Beatrix Vane. The hall itself transformed from a cold, marble monument into a living, breathing home. The heavy velvet curtains that once stifled the light were replaced by sheer silks that danced in the breeze. The silent corridors now echoed with the sound of laughter and the frantic, joyful paws of the hounds Bibi had insisted on bringing inside. Gabriel St. The man once known as the Great Duke of Ravenwood, was rarely seen in his navy velvet evening coats anymore. He could often be found in the library or the gardens in his linen shirt sleeves, his high-collared cravats a relic of a past life he no longer recognized. He was still tall, still dark-haired, and still possessed that sharp jawline, but the brooding mask had melted away to reveal a man whose eyes finally danced with a quiet, certain peace. Bibi remained as fearless and scandalous as ever, her fiery red hair flowing wildly as she rode astride through the estate, her emerald-green gowns catching the sunlight. She never did mend those tattered sleeves, she wore them as badges of honor, a reminder of the day she reached out and pulled a duke from the wreckage of his own perfection. They were no longer the outcasts of the ton, they were the pioneers of a life where passion outweighed propriety. They spent their days rebuilding the estate not through fear of ruin, but through the joy of creation, turning Ravenwood into a sanctuary for those who felt suffocated by the rigid expectations of the world. As they stood together on the terrace where their journey began, watching the sunset dip below the horizon, Gabriel pulled Bibi into his space with a sense of ownership that was no longer a struggle, but a homecoming. He looked at the woman who had dared to be too bold, too loud, and too much, and he realized that she was the only thing that had ever truly been enough. This story of the Duke and the Lady teaches us a vital lesson about the masks we all wear to fit into the world. We are often told that our flaws, our boldness, our intensity, our refusal to follow the rules are the things that make us unlovable. We build cages of duty and propriety, thinking they will keep us safe, only to find that they are the very things keeping us from living. But the truth is, you cannot be truly loved if you are only showing the world your mask. True intimacy and true freedom require the courage to be scandalous enough to be yourself. Because, in the end, it is the fire we try so hard to hide that is the only thing capable of keeping our hearts warm.